Welcome to the Obstacle Dominator podcast. Explore what it takes to dominate any obstacle you may encounter in life and get a glimpse inside the minds of the most interesting people on the planet. Now, here's your host, Benny Gifford.
So, we're chilling. Well, actually, Alex, why don't you tell me again where you're currently at?
I am cozied up in my cabin here in the Pacific Northwest on Vashon Island, and the rain is coming down pretty hard right now, so I am just loving this tranquil space that I call home now.
That's beautiful. I am not in a cabin. I mean, I love my home and I love my studio, but my studio is essentially a room that I have filled with like spare mattresses and blankets and towels to deaden sound echoing stuff to make the audio better. So that's no cabin in the woods in the rain. That sounds awesome over there.
It is. It's beautiful. You know, I think it's depending on the person, right? Some people, the weather really gets to them. If they don't see the sunshine and the blue skies, these winter months can be tough. But I grew up here and I love being surrounded by nature and I cherish the rain. You know, I think the water is a blessing.
Yeah, you know, I've thought about that quite a bit. I was born in Mesa, Arizona, the desert. Then I was raised in Texas, which is just a green desert. And every time I'm somewhere where it's raining, I feel so alive and there's so much energy and it just feels like life. But I wonder if that's because the default is sun and then we get a reprise of rain. I wonder if I would enjoy it if it was the other way around, if the majority of the time it was, you know, that overcast weather and then sunny.
Yeah, it can be tough for sure. It tests people's patience. And I think we're still in the early half of the rainy season. So check back in with me in February and I might be singing a different song.
Well, I intend to test out the Pacific Northwest as a home base for a while at some point because it's too beautiful to not test out. Before we get any further in here, I want to make sure everybody knows who we're talking to here. So this is Alex Craighead, and why do I have you on here, my friend? How do I know you? And why don't you tell me about your organization?
Yeah, well, first of all, Benjamin, thank you for reaching out and inviting me to be on the podcast. I was truly honored to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm real excited to do so.
Nice. Well, I remember first getting connected through Matt Walrath, who I believe you guys met each other through different challenge course competitions. And Matt Walrath has actually worked with us in our nonprofit here in the Pacific Northwest a couple summers ago. And we are providing mentorship and nature-based rites of passage for adolescent and teen boys here in the Puget Sound area, just around the Seattle and Tacoma part of Washington. So our nonprofit's called Journeymen, and we are currently in our 4th year of offerings. And yeah, it's been a beautiful journey. I've been in my adult life, I've been a teacher for about 8 years now, and working with all the different age groups. So from elementary through high school, I've worked in inner city schools and rural schools. And throughout my time, I've really come to realize that we aren't meeting the needs of young people strictly through what we provide in the public school systems. So one of my dear brothers and I started dreaming up, like, what else can we do? What else is missing? And between the visions that we started to co-create and then a lot of the social issues that were coming up in our culture, we were led to the conclusion that it was time to start Journeymen. And so our vision is quite simple, really. The vision for Journeymen is men of integrity, respecting all, thriving together.
Nice. I love that. So before I dive into the million questions that I've got about your organization, what do these initiations look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I love talking about, because I think, well, there's a lot of people when they hear the word rites of passage or initiation, they kind of immediately jump to those old school ideas of a rite of passage where, you know, you send the boys out and they got to go hunt a lion or jump off a big cliff with vines tied around their ankles. And back in the day, sometimes people weren't coming back from their initiation. They weren't surviving their rite of passage. And, in modern times, we kind of had to readjust. And what we feel is that there's really a lack of rites of passage in our culture these days. There's certain types that have different types of meaning, right? So there's initiation in the sense of, for people affiliated with gangs, there's initiation. There's certain types of hazing or initiation within certain sports teams and fraternities. But it feels as though our culture has really lost the real meaning behind and the significance behind a traditional or a more transformational initiation or rite of passage. And when I say rite of passage, for your listeners that might not know, we're coming from an understanding that a rite of passage is really an intentional marking or celebration of an important life transition. And the transition that we really focus on is from adolescence into young adulthood, and specifically working with boys. And that's for a long list of reasons that I imagine we can dive into in this conversation. But to get back to your question, what does our rite of passage look like? Our young men's initiation is about 10 days long, and we start and end here in our community. So on Vashon Island, which is where we're currently located. And so it's really community-centered rites of passage where their families are present for the start and end of the experience. They can bring their siblings, their mom and dad, aunts and uncles, grandparents, whoever feels called to participate. And then the core group of the guides and the mentors, and then the young men participating in this experience, we actually leave the island and go out into the mountains, usually in the North Cascades here in Washington. And we prepare each young man for a 24-hour solo. So they get a chance to go out in the mountains, find their own space, build their own shelter, and they also fast for 24 hours. And during that time, they're invited to really consider what parts of themselves are no longer serving them at this stage in life. Like, what are they ready to let go of? And also to start thinking about, like, what is their vision for the future? Who do they see themselves becoming, and what do they want to bring to this life? And when they return, it's a chance for us as the mentors, the elders, and the community members to really kind of hold up a mirror and reflect back to them, like, what we see, what we feel and see as their unique gifts. And one of our beliefs is that every person on this planet has their own unique gift, their own unique qualities or spirit about them that isn't matched by any other person, and that they're really needed in our community, that they're essential here, that they serve a purpose. And so the intention behind this is to have each young person in our community feel that they belong, feel that they have purpose, and start having an understanding of where they hope to go in their lives. And our job as mentors is to just help them along that path, to be supportive however we can, to ask the right questions, to ask the tough questions. Sometimes I think so often we're conditioned to live in a culture of comfort. And so, every rite of passage traditionally throughout history has always had some form of challenge. And so since we can't have them hunting lions anymore, I'd say our biggest part of the challenge is the 24-hour solo and fast. But, if you ask a teenage boy, going 10 days without electronics or knowing what time it is, that in itself is a challenge. And also from an adult's perspective, kind of fun to witness them squirm in the discomfort of not knowing what time it is or what's for dinner or what's happening next, because we're so conditioned to knowing, like, our schedule and getting into these rhythms. So by removing some of those known factors, what's for dinner, what time is it, having their phone, we start to get our participants into this place of discomfort, which in our belief is actually required for transformation, that we don't evolve and we don't transform into better versions of ourselves if we just stay comfortable all the time.
That's fascinating, because I love how on your website, to your point right there, you guys have a quote on there that says, "Growth requires discomfort, not pain." And that's a fantastic, important, very applicable distinction, because those two, they can blur together. And I think a lot of people blur them together when there's a pretty clear separation between those two. You don't necessarily need pain to grow. You just need discomfort and change from what you're normally involved with, which a 24-hour experience out in nature with no distractions definitely sounds uncomfortable, especially for someone at that age.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, and I think it's important, like, there are other experiences, I think, that really push that limit of maybe going too far and putting people in a place of pain or trauma. And it's a fine line to walk, and each young person has a different threshold. So it's an art as a guide facilitating these types of experiences, really getting an understanding of each person's edge, which, when I refer to an edge, I'm talking about the edge of their comfort zone and the edge of their discomfort zone that would ultimately lead into danger or trauma, which we obviously don't want to steer into those territories.
Right. Speaking of, I guess, male role models, that's something my father was really good at. When the majority of the place where I feel like my father was a good male role model for me was when we would spend about 8 hours on almost every Saturday out dirt biking, going through hundreds of miles of terrain and stuff. And he always had these little quips for me, like little pieces of wisdom. And one of them was, when you're dirt biking and we're flying through these trails, you want to find your comfort zone, and you want to be hovering on the edge of that and just slightly past it. But that doesn't mean you go, hurtling past it, because that's when it's the opposite of a return on your investment, and it's too big, and it's too big of a risk, and it's not actual growth anymore. You'll injure yourself. You set yourself back.
Exactly.
And that's a real art, finding what you're talking about there. That was one of my questions. Was I had been reading about the edge on your website, and I was wondering, you said it great there, how it's an art to be able to identify with each different person where their edge is, and getting them to be hovering right around on that edge, but not doing something way past it. How do you work with the group dynamic? There's one boy, whole boy, two boy, half boy, three boy, no boy. I'm assuming, you have groups of young men on these trips. When each one has different comfort zones and edges, how are you able to let each one be in their own area without the the influence of the group making them go maybe a little bit farther than they should?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the day before their solo challenge, we get to walk the land, and each boy gets to explore and find their place of power, really just tap into their intuition and see what part of the mountain is calling to them for their solo spot. And there's a challenge with that, in that they have to do a whoop call, which is our kind of communication system out in the mountains. So once they feel like they've picked their spot, they need to be able to do their whoop call for us at base camp to be able to hear. And that's a part of safety. And if we can't hear them, then they actually need to come and pick a closer spot, or summon the lion within and really belt out a louder, heavier whoop so that it can echo throughout the mountains.
Okay.
So they're kind of scattered throughout. Like, if you imagine our base camp is the central spot, and then you got boys scattered 360 degrees in different directions going out from there. And, as I mentioned, like, each boy has their own specific needs from that experience. So, for example, we've had one young man who what he needed was very different from being alone out in the mountain for 24 hours. What he needed was to be surrounded by healthy mentors and adults in his life that were just going to be there for him. So he actually stayed with the adult mentors and stayed at base camp, and we had him become the fire tender, and he actually got to keep the fire going all night while his brothers did their solos out on the mountain, and he welcomed them home. He was the first person to welcome them back in the morning when they returned. And that gave him what he needed. His medicine was different from what others needed out there. And yeah, it was powerful. And another example that comes to mind is there's another young man who, he started to have a hard time out there on his own, and he came back to the group, and what he realized was that he processes his emotions with other people. And he had some strong feelings coming up, and he just needed to talk to a couple of mentors, talk through what he was going through. And we had a good cry and we were there for him, heard him out. And then, within an hour, he felt like he was ready to go back out there, and he had the rest of his time and his day out alone, and just had this magical experience. But for me, it was so beautiful to witness, like, wow, here we are, this 16-year-old young man has already figured out like how he prefers to process his emotions and some of the stronger feelings that come up in his life. And that is a huge victory, because this is one of those things that we really hope for our young guys, is like to help connect them to their hearts. On the back of our sweatshirts, it says it's all from the heart. And for us, it's really like helping these young men tap into this different part of our body, this different place of knowing that we so often are disconnected from. So that was a really beautiful moment, and just another example of, how each person has different needs out there when they're doing their solo.
Yeah. And that's amazing. You hit the nail on the head there with talking about how amazing it is that a 16-year-old young man was able to identify how he expresses and processes emotions, because I witness all the time, full-blown adults don't know how to do that. They don't have clarity on processing what's going on. I found out from a very young age that I'm an external processor. I guess sounds similar to this young man. I spend a lot of time by myself, and that's extremely valuable, but I find it extremely easy to make progress on internal things that I'm trying to figure out when I can externally process. And usually it's to somebody who can just be a really good wall to talk to. Like, I'm not necessarily looking for you to give me advice, but when I can speak to somebody and I know they're actively listening, I'll figure almost everything out just by hearing myself talk. Like, I'll be my own therapist, essentially. So it sounds like he had a piece of that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So have you ever heard of an ashram, Alex?
I have, but I'm not too familiar with it.
So I hate to say the word retreat, because it's more, that makes it sound like a vacation. I went to this place called the Himalayan Institute. It's an ashram in Pennsylvania, out in the mountains somewhere. And I sent myself here when I was about 19. I grew up Mormon, and I was full-fledged Christian Mormon. Like, that was my entire identity. That was the a priori structure from which I made all decisions in my life. And when I was about 18, I left the church. And I didn't leave because I knew there was something else I wanted. I just knew that where I was not in sync or in alignment with me. And that's a pretty scary place to be, because you don't know where you're going to. And so at that time, there was a really tumultuous point in my life. I didn't like the things that were going on in my head. I essentially hated myself and was confused about everything. And so I sent myself to this ashram in Pennsylvania, and it's silent, it's vegan, there's no electronics, there's no technology. It's all about yoga. It's where a lot of the gurus from the Himalayan mountains come when they're visiting America. And it's just, the entire point of the experience for me was no distractions. And I found out very, very quickly that when you remove all distractions, that can be extremely uncomfortable if you do not like who you are, what's going on inside. And I was able to successfully kind of distract myself for about the first week, because it's a new place. I'm in the mountains. It's, new food and stuff. But after about a week, I hit this point where I was miserable. I was suicidal. I was depressed. I was horribly emotional, and I couldn't get anything straight in my head. And then after about 4 or 5 days of that, I woke up and I was doing a whole lot of yoga and meditation and taking yoga classes while I was there, and karma yoga and stuff. So I wasn't just sitting around. And at the end of that second week, I just started having epiphany after epiphany after epiphany of just peace and understanding, and being okay with the fact that I don't know everything, and I don't know where I'm going to go when I die, and I don't know this and that, and all the big questions in my life at the time. I just became at peace with all of it. And by the time that I was done living at this place, after it was like 30, 40 days, I didn't want to leave. And it was just the peace of being out in nature and not having all the complexity that can rise up while you're distracted being on your phone or playing video games or hanging out with friends, or, you know, the normal stuff that normally fills, I guess, modern days people's lives, that builds up in the background while they're not taking account of themselves. And I would have loved to have had an experience like that when I was a young boy. I mean, I was a part of Boy Scouts and we went camping and stuff, but it wasn't so much guided as it sounds like your guys's are, or as intentional. It was just, you know, get out in nature, camping, boys screwing around and having a good time, which I'm sure is a part of your trip too, but there wasn't really an intent to it. And that leads into, I guess, the next part I want to chat with you about, where I want to talk about what led you to thinking that, well, being aware that this was even a need, whether it was within yourself or you saw it in maybe, I don't know if you have kids. I was doing a really intense therapeutic experience a little while ago, and my guide referred to me just in passing as a man. And I felt a huge disconnect with that word. Like, I don't feel like a boy, but I don't feel like a man. Like, I feel like a guy. I'm a dude. I'm a guy. And when she referred to me as a man, I was hyper aware of the disconnect I felt with that name. And I thought in my mind, I was like, oh, well, this guy is a man and that guy is a man, but I don't feel like a man. And that's when I started realizing, I think it was right around that time that Matt introduced me to you. And that's why I was super fascinated about wanting to chat with you. So for me, that's when I became aware of a huge lack of initiations. Like, I kind of just became a man because I'm 18 or whatever. Like, there was no change. There was no sudden, okay, you're a man now. So what kind of made you aware that that there was a need you could fill here?
That's a great question. And I'm just excited to talk about this because it's so ripe right now in our culture. And we actually have a tagline on our website that's "Boys are born, men are initiated." And I imagine there's going to be some people that disagree with that sentiment. But I, similar to you, Benjamin, was at a point in my life in my early 20s. I was in college. I was, you know, of age. So I was 21, able to go to bars and travel. And I didn't feel like a man. I was, quote unquote, an adult. I lived on my own. I had my own place, but there was something missing. And so rites of passage, it's really about each individual claiming that next stage of life, claiming the identity for themselves. And we like to say in our work that identity precedes purpose. So many people, especially adults in our culture, ask, you know, high schoolers, they ask their students, they ask their children, what are you going to be when you grow up? What do you want to do with your life when you grow up? Like, and there's so much pressure to have it all figured out. And I think a lot of young people experience anxiety because they feel this pressure to know what they're going to do when they're done with high school. What are they going to do when they're done with college? But so many of them, they don't even know who they are yet. And so how can we know what our gifts are for the world, like what we're meant to do in terms of our career or our purpose, if we don't even really have a solid sense of self, like who am I at my core? And so the big piece of an initiation or a rite of passage is to help each young person establish for themselves, like, what is their core identity? Are they a young man? Are they compassionate? Are they of integrity? Like, what are their core values? What are their core identities that they're wanting to claim as they step into this next chapter? And so to circle back and answer your question of how we came to this place of feeling that there was a gap or a void in our culture, for me, it started, as I mentioned earlier, in the public education system. And I started to notice a lot of patterns with my boy students. Typically, a lot of the behavior issues where kids were getting sent to the principal's office and things like that were typically boys. A lot of behavior issues out on the playground and at lunchtime were boys, you know, causing a ruckus, you know, getting mischievous or getting physical. And then as they got older in the high school ages, it was drunk driving accidents. It was overdosing. It was getting into fights. It was suicide. And not to say that girls don't experience those things as well, but it's much more at alarming more rates for boys at that age and stage. And so that was kind of my first red flag, was seeing these patterns. And then right around the same time, we're seeing more and more school shootings happen at the hands of young men. We're seeing the Me Too movement come to light. And all of these things, to me, kept just refocusing my attention on the theme of young men often causing harm. Not saying that all young men cause harm, not saying that all men are bad, but that we have been conditioned in a patriarchal society that basically conditions us to believe that we need to tough it up. We need to man up. We can't cry like a girl or be soft or be a pussy. And so what happens was we were conditioning ourselves to suppress certain emotions, suppress sadness, suppress shame, suppress fear. And with that, we start carrying more and more weight, this heavier and heavier burden, to the point where often it gets so much so that we either implode and turn to substances to numb the pain, or in extreme cases, people are taking their own lives. And conversely, to explode, where we're just lashing out with anger or whatever emotion is driving the bus, and we're causing harm to our spouses or to our children or to our peers at school. And so in noticing all these patterns and in noticing all these red flags in our culture, in our society, we really, Nikki, myself, and I, Nikki is my co-pilot in this work and co-founder of Journeymen. Him and I really started doing a lot of research, and we started reaching out to our mentors and people that we looked up to in youth development work. And so we started doing a lot of reading, and in that research, what we had kind of originally talked about when forming the ideas of Journeymen was originally just about mentorship and also about apprenticeship. But the rites of passage piece wasn't initially in our vision. But as we continued to do the research, we recognized that that was another layer that was missing, especially in Western society. And one of the things that we came across is that if we don't provide rites of passage, or also known as an initiation, if we don't provide meaningful initiations for our young people, then they're moving on into that next stage of life without shifting their psychology around it. So we've got these adult men, like grown bodies, in like a boy psychology still, where they kind of operate in the sense of like narcissism or entitlement, or just like the universe revolves around me. And, at the age of 5, at the age of 10, like those are totally developmentally normal things to feel and think. But as we shift into adulthood, our perspectives need to shift so that we can be healthy, nurturing adults and provide for the next generation, and start having an awareness about the people around us and the environment around us. And oftentimes that's not happening. That shift isn't happening.
So like you pointed out earlier, you mentioned fraternities and hazing. And it's funny, I had never actually thought about hazing as kind of a rite of entrance. It just seemed like something that, older kids like to do to younger kids. Like when you're a senior in high school, you make fun of the freshmen, even though you were just one of them a few years ago. And they, I think they are ill-inspired and kind of silly most of the time, don't actually accomplish what they should be doing. So what are some important components of a successful initiation, like one that's actually doing well? First, I guess, could you describe in, I don't know, some sexy little soundbite, what the ultimate purpose of initiation is, like the problems it's solving for, and things like that, and then what kind of important components need to go into a rite of passage in order to achieve that and be able to solve or begin to solve some of those issues you just illustrated?
Yeah, great question. Well, real quickly, in our line of work, and specifically the transition that we're focusing on from adolescence to young adulthood, the core things that we're really addressing is what parts of ourselves are no longer serving us. So identifying aspects of ourselves that it's time to let go of. So for example, in my vision quest, in my rite of passage as a young adult, I needed to let go of being super critical on myself and others, to let go of judgment, like I was really harsh on myself, to let go of carelessness. I was kind of a reckless young man for a while. And some of those things were really holding me back and preventing me from being my best self. So what do we need to let go of to be our best self? who are we? Like, what are we ready to claim for ourselves? So our core identity, a healthy, positive identity. What are our gifts for the world? And that's done with the support and expertise of the guides that can ask the right questions and help that draw that out from the young person. And then finally, what is their vision for the future? How do they hope to share their gifts with the world? And so those are kind of the core outcomes that we're working towards in our Rites of Passage. And we were lucky enough to be mentored by a man named Dr. Arne Rubinstein. And he is based out of Byron Bay, Australia. He's been doing similar work with teen boys and young men for the past 30 years. And I love how this happened. And it actually feels perfect that it's coming up right now, because this all started with a podcast. We reached out to Arne a couple of years ago, asking if we could interview him for our podcast, Right Ways Radio. And he responded with, yes, what else? How can I help? And shortly after, he basically offered to come all the way to the Seattle area from Australia to help us run our very first camp, to help us put on a leadership training, and then to do a speaking event at Seattle University.
Wow.
So we, all of a sudden, our very first camps ever, we've got this expert flying all the way from the other side of the world to help walk us through it and mentor Nikki and myself in leading this kind of work. So that was a huge blessing. And one of the things that we've learned from Arne, which it's a long list of things, but he had shed some light on some research of a man named Arne van Genept. He was Dutch, and he studied initiation and rites of passage all over the world. He traveled and interviewed indigenous folks and started learning like different practices, and ultimately synthesized that information to understand like what are some of the core pieces of initiation rites around the world. And he identified 4 common elements. And so we do our best to weave these 4 pieces into everything that we do. And the first is storytelling. That every rite of passage around the world, there was some element of storytelling. And earlier, Ben, you mentioned like advice, right? You had mentioned advice giving and how that sometimes doesn't work for people, especially teen boys. Like if we're just telling them how to live or telling them what to do, they often just put up a wall and stop listening. But when we tell a story, that gives them the opportunity to practice discernment and to take what nugget in that story is meaningful for them, and they can start, forming their own opinions about right and wrong, or take the meaning from the story and use it in their life however it's applicable, rather than some authority telling them what to do or how to live.
That's a fascinating little I guess psychological extrapolation, because I've always noticed that especially as a kid, when I would be people are always amazed at the amount of time that Mormons go to church or participate in church activities. And as a kid, that especially a kid like me without a lot of energy and air quotes ADHD and stuff like that, I found that when I was listening to like a 4-hour conference, I loved the speakers that would tell stories. It was just so much easier. And the way you just described it made me realize that when people, like a leader, they're telling you the points that like the end goal learning points of the story rather than the actual story and letting you figure it out for yourself. That's removing the journey of actually figuring out for yourself, which I think we're naturally wired to desire that journey. And so when somebody just breaks it down to bullet points for us, which sounds like a great idea once you're on the other side of it, it's not. It's super unappealing, because it's like you're removing the entire point of this experience by just telling me you're telling me the end of the story basically without telling me the story.
Exactly. Yeah. And people shut off, and it's especially when it's unwelcome. Like how many times have we gotten advice from adults in our lives when we never asked for it?
Yeah. Oh man, countless times.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a power in that. I remember hearing a brief example of this where indigenous elders, they knew that a lot of the lessons that they wanted their young people to learn, they wouldn't engage in it in certain ways, but so what they did was they waited until the kids had gone off to sleep. And then they started telling certain stories that they actually knew these kids had kind of snuck out of bed, and they were listening and peeking in from the outside, listening to the elders have a conversation. knowing that the kids were listening, but the kids thought they couldn't hear. And so they did that. And that was a part of their practice, because they knew as soon as these kids thought they weren't supposed to be hearing this, or that they weren't supposed to be listening, they listened even more. And so it was something called Coyote Mentoring, which is basically tricking someone into learning something when they don't think they're supposed to be learning it, or when they don't think they're actually learning it. And I think there's ways to do that with stories, where it's like, okay, we have this lesson, or we have this value. Maybe it's integrity, maybe it's compassion, maybe it's of being of service, right? Where we want our young people to be compassionate or to be of service. But rather than saying, hey, you need to be more honest, it's like, let me tell you a story. And the character in this story has a bunch of implications that come up in their life by being dishonest or by manipulation. And then the young people can start to form their own opinions about honesty and being a person of integrity or not.
That is so, it's so fascinating to me how human beings operate. Are you familiar with either Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris?
Yes.
So there's like a 12-hour conversation, debate, lecture, however you want to refer to it, that I've watched. It's both of them talking, and they have a mediator. And I've watched it about 3 times because it's fascinating watching two minds of this level talk back and forth. The premise of the discussion is, where does morality come from? Can it exist in the absence of religion, or is religion the entire reason that we have a moral spectrum? Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson are arguably, the greatest philosophical minds of the 21st century, and they agree on like 99% of things. But Sam Harris is an atheist, and Jordan Peterson, I don't know if he identifies as a Christian, but for the sake of this discussion, he's representing the religion side of things. And the point that for 12 hours they're dancing around is that the value of the Bible, that's the main religious book that they're talking about, is not necessarily in the lessons that come from it, because the lessons can be taught by anybody, anywhere, any book. It's the value of the stories. And Sam Harris is saying intelligent human beings should be able to take the lessons without all the crazy stories. And Jordan Peterson is making a statement saying human beings don't operate like that. Maybe some people do, but the point is stories drive those points so deep that, it's worth the downside of religion. And then the whole conversation is about the pros and cons and total, risk reward of the stories and stuff like that. But that's such a great point. People learn so well. This is why I have always loved movies and fantasy books and Disney movies. So many people, like, I cry in almost every Disney movie I've ever seen, because they're telling insane, amazing stories. But because it's cartoon or it's animated or it's fake or it's about magic, people like adults just have this switch where they're like, it's a kid's thing, it doesn't hold any depth or whatever, it's just for fun. Like Disney movies hold some of the most amazing applicable life lessons. And like I love reading fantasy books because they suspend your expectation of learning lessons, and then because that expectation is suspended, you learn things and grow in ways that you wouldn't if you were in a classroom setting where you're intentionally there to like try and learn something wholesome. So that's awesome that you guys are doing it. So how does that result in the actual experience? Are you guys sitting around, are you doing that? Would you call it Coyote Mentoring?
Yeah. I would say there's a piece of that for sure. And we often talk about the sentiments of the collective wisdom of the circle, which is to say that every person, whether it's one of the young boys or one of our adult mentors in that circle, has something relevant for the group to hear. And so everybody gets to speak and share a piece of their story. So sometimes we invite stories around challenges in our lives. Sometimes we invite stories about relationships in our lives. Sometimes we invite stories about our relationship with our father and what kind of father we would want to be if we were to become a father. Just stories of our teenage years, so they can hear from adult men, like what it was like for them when they were a teenager. What were some of the challenges that they went through? I think we live in a culture so often where we have this idea that it's all on the parents, the nuclear family model, that the parents need to raise the kids. And if something goes wrong with Jimmy, then it's mom and dad's fault. But we're shifting away from that. At Journeymen, we really want to get back to the village model where every young person is seen and supported by all the adults in the community, that it's all of our responsibility to support these people. And by the time they're teenagers, they're much more likely to receive and listen to stories and information from other role models, other men or women that they look up to in their community, aside from just mom and dad or whoever their parents are. Because, you know, we start to shift that teenage, at some point within those teenage years, we start to need to cut the ties from the dependence on our parent figures and wanting to step into more of a place of independence. And so I think when it's coming from adults that are non-parents, then it just lands in a different way. It's simple yet powerful.
How do you apply the village model with the size of the country that we live in? To get more specific, I didn't realize that I had a complete lack of sense of community until I went to the obstacle course racing world championships in I'd gone to it several years in a row, and there had always been this feeling every time I would see these other nations, these smaller countries like the Netherlands and in Belgium, running around with their flags and singing their national anthem, and there was just a real community vibe with them. And I would watch them. It was amazing. I loved watching the international feel, but I had this feeling of discomfort when I would watch them, and I couldn't figure out exactly what it was, and so I would kind of shove it away. It was a busy weekend, whatever. And finally, when I went to the UK for the World Championships, I realized that it was almost jealousy, the feeling that I was feeling, because I realized I don't feel that at all with my country. And so I started trying to figure out why that is. Because, you know, America is one of the loudest patriotic countries there is. They're obsessed with saying, America, you know, we're the best. And I wondered why I didn't feel this feeling of community. And I started looking at these nations, and I was like, they're all super tiny. Like, they have to band together. It's I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier when there's not, I mean, I have no idea how many millions of people are in this country, but when you have a village model like that in a country this size, how big can you make your tribe before you start losing that community sense?
It's a great question. Yeah, and it's a living question for us at Journeymen. I really feel like that's something that we're exploring as we speak and as we grow. How do we want to grow? How can we sustain this while maintaining the integrity of these relationships and of this village that we're creating? For your listeners that don't know, we are currently living on Vashon Island, which is, you know, about 12,000 people just outside of the Seattle area. And so we kind of have a blessing, like a physical blessing of a contained community where everybody on Vashon is surrounded by water. So we're kind of like a forced community, which has its pros and cons for sure. But it's tougher when you get into the city and suburbia. It's like, how do you cultivate that? And I really think it's going to require a massive culture shift in so many different ways. But you know, ranging from how do we get our food, right? Are we outsourcing all of our shopping to Amazon, or are we going and engaging in the local stores in our village to support local businesses and to build those relationships with other community members? Or do we just do Amazon Prime because it comes in 2 days and it's way cheaper? I think those types of technological advances are preventing us from actually having community and supporting one another. But so many beautiful things come up through having community, like where we're from. Like, you know, we have this peak experience like the Quest, our 10-day initiation, but then we see these young guys every month. Like, we do ongoing mentorship and support for this group throughout the school year, but because it's a community, because we live in more of a village model, we are able to see these folks and able to support them ongoing and know when something's going on in their family. It's like, oh, maybe they have a health issue in the family. We're able to kind of support them and their family through that. as time goes on. Whereas a lot of programs, people come from all over the country to go to this experience, and then they go back and they never see each other again. And I think there's positive outcomes that can come from a transformational experience like that, but without having the ongoing support afterwards to integrate those changes back into your everyday life, it's really hard to sustain those changes after a peak experience if you don't have support afterwards. And so that's where the community comes in.
Yeah, your website says integration brings it home. In a world of abundant peak experiences, the real work happens every day and support extends long after the last day of camp. And that one really stood out for me because I've noticed, because the first 18 years of my life were all religious, I have so many of the applicable stories from the Bible and the Book of Mormon that pop up. And one of them was, and those two I learned together. So I don't even know which one this is from, but I think it's a Bible. There's that story of some rich sheik or king or something, and he has leprosy or he has some kind of sickness. And he says, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go on some crazy epic trek to the other side of the world. I'll do whatever it takes. And then I don't know if it's Jesus or a prophet. They say, hey, you don't have to do that. Just go wash in this filthy river that's right next to you. And the guy's like, what? That's too easy. That's not, no, I'll go do something big, but I'm not going to do that. And it seems so stupid when you're reading it. You're like, how dumb are you? The dude just said, just wash and you're good. And, and it's similar to what we're talking about here. Like, people love big efforts, big peak experiences. I mean, you see it with New Year's resolutions. People are like, I'm going to work out 3 times a day, every day. And then before 2 weeks are over, it was too much and they're done because of that integration, that lack of integration. So how do you, again, with such a big community and tribe, well, I guess you kind of just answered it. It's the best you can do is offer the available mentorship and try and keep the connection and the communication going. Because otherwise yes, you learned from it and you grew from it, but the real change, I guess, comes from the day-to-day integration of it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And, what's sitting alive for me right now is just the sentiments that you don't have to go far to go deep. And, we're kind of in this place of growth right now as an organization. And we've had to think about, well, do we really want to just expand our offerings and grow far and wide? Or do we really want to grow deep and really sink our roots here into this community? And ultimately, that's kind of what we've come back to. It's like really focusing locally and really growing our work here in this region, here in the Pacific Northwest, with the hopes that perhaps it inspires others and we can be a model of what it might look like, where every young person, boy, girl, gender non-binary, have access to mentorship throughout their school year, have access to rites of passage when they're going through those big life transitions, and also engage in community service and be a part of their village. And so other parts of the country hopefully can see this, that it's working, and that young people are making the positive changes in their lives, and hopefully can take that to their community or their neighborhood or their city. And there's a lot of great work happening all over the country as well. And I think it really stems from people with a vision and the passion to make it happen are really focusing in their communities, and focusing locally, because I think that's really where we're going to make the biggest impact.
With your reference to Amazon earlier, and you brought up Trump briefly in our conversation before we started recording, it made me start thinking about the nation as a whole and the broad scheme of things. I feel like as we're talking here, it's kind of like on its face, it looks like you either have to have these crazy technological advances like Amazon, or you have the value that tribes and communities bring to each other. Because when you have a whole bunch of little communities all over the place without, losing that sense of community and just having everybody, I'm not voicing it very well, but like Amazon exists because it spans across all these different communities. Like you can get something, I could order something and have it be here before 8 a.m. tomorrow. But if we were all a bunch of different tribes where we're all more so focused on the things you're talking about, it's almost like you have to pick and choose which benefit you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that in certain ways, right? It's like, do we want the convenience of things where things are just dropped at our door for half the cost, or are we willing to pay extra and drive to the store, the mom and pop shop, 10 minutes from our house? And I think that's really ultimately about where our values lie. What are we prioritizing?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't necessarily have any kind of answer for that. It's just something that popped up as I was thinking about this. Was I don't really know how you mix those two together. But with one of your pillars that you were talking about who am I? How do you help somebody? That's something that I've been mildly confused on for a long time, and studied quite a bit. And the last point I'm at, where I don't really know where to go from there, because maybe it's the end, I'm not sure, on the topic of figuring out who you are, it's a technique, a story, I don't know, where you ask somebody who they are, and then they say, my name's Benjamin. They're like, okay, well, if I change your name to Zachary, are you now a different person? And they're like, okay, I'm this body that is 6'3", 170 pounds, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, if 10 years ago when you were shorter, were you not Benjamin? Or if you get fat next week, are you no longer Benjamin? And so you follow that down until you have no more descriptive answers except for saying, I am me. And that's the last thing you can say. But it's a full circle. Like, it just brings you back over to the beginning of the question, which is, okay, but what does that mean? So how are you taking such a complex question? And I assume the lead up to the 24-hour solo thing, you guys talk about things like this so that maybe they've got some food for thought. I don't know if you give them some intentional things that they're supposed to do out there, or if it's just the intention is 24 hours by yourself. But how do you kind of help them navigate that plane of figuring out who they are?
I'm just smiling right now because I'm really grateful you asked this question. It's one of my favorite parts of our work and favorite parts of the experience out there on the quest is this process of extrapolating, like, who are they at their core? What are they ready to claim? And it starts very similarly, where each young person gets a turn in the hot seat, so to speak. So we're sitting in a circle, and when it's the person's time, when they feel ready, they go to the hot seat. And there's usually two guides leading this process of helping them ultimately formulate their identity, their claiming statement that they're ready to step into. And as we frame it, it's really asking the young men, like, who are you ready to, like, become? Like, what's right in front of you? Parts of yourself that you know are there, but you haven't been claiming fully, or you haven't been living into fully. Like, what's that growth edge for you that's going to help you on your path in this next chapter of life? And so it's ever changing, right? What might be true for them at 16 might be easy and, not relevant at 25. They might be ready for something totally different, to step into something even deeper, or even more expansive than they could have imagined as a teenager. But it starts with that same question of, who are you? And it's so fascinating to ask such a simple question and see what comes through for people. And from that place, that's our starting place. But the guides from there are able to work with whatever is shared or not shared, and continue to peel back the layers and ask more and more questions, and often poke and prod a little bit, because I think most people don't want to go to the heart of some of these conversations or some of these questions right off the bat, that they need to be nudged a little bit. And a big part of that is, like, understanding, like, what are some of our wounds, or some of those pieces of ourselves that we need to work through. And so I'll use myself for example. When I was coming of age, I was super uncomfortable in my body. I had bad acne and I was really skinny. So I carried a lot of shame around my body and struggled with self-love. The other kind of wounds that I was carrying into adulthood was around shame of expression, and, like, fear of being seen as like not worth sharing my perspectives or my voice, or being rejected or not accepted. So I really stifled myself in speaking my mind sometimes, or sharing my writing, or singing, or just being expressive, because I didn't want to be rejected. I had this fear of not being good enough or not being accepted. So shame and fear were two big drivers for me. And so as I formulated my claiming statement, or my identity in this next chapter of what I was ready to start living into, those were important pieces for me to claim, so I could step more fully into wholeness. And it may help as an example for me to share like my claiming statement, what came through from that process of the initial question, who are you? And what I was led to through many questions, and through, for me on my solo, I did a 4-day fast. And what came through for me was, I am a courageous, compassionate, and inspiring man who loves himself. Love for life ignites my spirit, guiding others through the night.
Okay.
And that's me. Like that's how I've put to words where I'm at in my life right now and who I am at my core. And I also feel very open to that changing and morphing and adapting as I grow and as I ask more questions of myself and of this world. But when I did my vision quest, that was what was alive for me, claiming this courageousness, claiming self-love, and also recognizing that a big part of who I am and what I hope to bring to the world is bringing light to help other people through darker times.
And the purpose of that claim, that statement, is a resonance to come back to as you're navigating all the different complexities of life.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, okay, where is my center? Like going through adversity, going through a challenge, going through darker times in our own personal lives, it can be a place to come back to. It's like, yeah, well, okay, who am I at my core? How do I want to respond to this? How do I want to move forward? And what's me moving forward in a place of wholeness, or what's me moving forward in a place of like my wounded self? Maybe the story of I'm not good enough is driving the bus. And so I respond from that place. Well, that's a very different response than like, I love myself. I'm courageous. Like I'm going to step through this with courage. And, even though I'm scared right now, I'm going to move forward because I know that I will be held, or I know I'm going to be okay.
That is beautiful and fascinating. It makes me think about, I had some direct mentorship going on with this really successful millionaire a long time ago. And one of the things he said that stood out, I mean, there's a lot of them, but what comes up right now is he said, happy, successful people make decisions quickly and change them slowly. Unsuccessful, unhappy people make decisions slowly and change them quickly. And at the time I was like, that seems counterintuitive, because you're telling me they just walk around making impulsive snap decisions all the time. And it took me a bit to figure it out, because again, he wasn't somebody who's going to take me by the nose and lead me through every journey. He was going to tell me things like that and have me figure it out. And eventually I figured out that that's because happy, successful people identify a statement like what you just said. And then as you're navigating through life, they can very quickly smash any decision up against that wall, that statement. And if it does not vibe with it, if it's not in alignment with it, it's a no. And that is such a cool, like, I've done this practice a million times, but I've never had the intent of having a claim, a statement that I could come back to. Like you were able to just rattle yours off there. I'm sure you haven't memorized at this point.
Yes.
And that is an extremely valuable tool, because with how much I change, I don't know if it's because I was so sheltered and I was homeschooled and Mormon. So my entire existence was that. Like the first time I heard a girl swear was freshman year of high school, when I got put back in public school, and it rocked my world, because I thought women were like these angelic, pure, sensitive creatures, and that's it. Like that's all they were. And tons of things like that just rocked me over and over. And every couple years, I look back on myself from 2 years before, and I'm a completely different person. Like 2 years ago, I had no ear piercings. I had no tattoos. I had never even tasted alcohol, never done any form of drug, nothing. I was in a self-expression box. And the 2 years before that, I was a different person. The 2 years before that, I was a different person. And so I've never been able to lock down kind of a resonating statement that has been alive through all those different changes. And now I feel like my life is in a little bit more of a, at the same time, very ethereal and all over the place, but a very stable place where I feel like I'm in a place where I could come up with a statement like that. And on that same therapeutic experience I had a couple months ago where I realized I didn't really resonate with the term man, I decided I wanted to participate in some kind of initiation ceremony. And obviously my brain immediately starts going to like, I want to wrestle a freaking bear, or, you know, all the crazy stuff we see on TV, like Leonidas killing that crazy wolf. And clearly I don't want to die, but I do want something challenging like that. And I think I went there to such extreme measures because my profession that I'm pursuing is obstacle course racing, and these experiences already feel like battles, like initiations. Like it's so painful and it's so raw, and you're out in nature and it's freezing and all this different stuff that I was like, okay, I have to step it up from there. But I don't know if mine is so much going to be a test of my physicality, so much as what you're talking about here with these 24 hours by yourself, no distractions. And I spend a lot of time by myself, but I mean, you talked about a 4-day fast there. I'd go crazy just from the hunger. How'd you do that?
Yeah, that was tough, honestly. And I'm kind of reminded of what you shared earlier in your ashram experience of how the first chapter of that experience was really tough. And you started to go to some pretty dark places before you came around and started having epiphanies and these other ideas coming through to you. And it reminds me of my experience out there on the land, where the first couple days were really uncomfortable. I felt sick to my stomach. I felt weak. I kind of got dizzy. But then near the second portion of my fast and solo, I started to have so many visions of who I wanted to be and what I wanted to bring to this life. And I don't journal very often just because of my lifestyle, but out there on my final day of my vision quest, I just started writing and pages of dreams and visions and goals for myself. And, you know, as I reflect back on that notebook and I see what I wrote, like I'm honestly, most of these things are starting to come to life as the years unfold since my vision quest, which was, I believe, in 2016. So here we are about 3 or 4 years later. That vision quest was right before we started Journeymen. And I was very fortunate enough that one of my other best friends, Nikki Wilkes, who we founded Journeymen together, he was also on that experience. So while we were both out on the land, we were separate, and we were both able to come to clarity on ourselves and our own personal experience, but also start creating what has now become Journeymen. And yeah, it was tough out there. You know, I had to lean on, I would say I leaned on my ancestors. I spoke with my grandparents who are no longer with us. I, for the very first time in my life, invited spirit into my life. You know, you mentioned your experience with being a Mormon growing up. My dad was a minister, and for the longest time, I did not resonate with the church. And I remember going to church on Sundays and just like playing with silly putty and drawing because I just didn't engage with the material as a boy. And I carried that kind of closed mentality into my adulthood around spirituality because of my experience with the church. And so when I did my vision quest, I was 27 years old. One of my big intentions out there was to just explore my connection with spirit, whatever that means. Like, do I believe? Am I open to that? And what I found was that, yes, I do feel like a spiritual person. I do feel connected with nature and with each individual being on this planet. And for me, that's like the simplest way of describing my sense of spirituality, is just this sense of oneness, this interconnected experience of life with the wind, with the trees, with the animals, with Mother Earth, with Father Sky. And, you know, I still don't identify with any one organized religion, but I will say that I felt very held out there on the land. And once I kind of accepted this relationship and surrendered, I felt taken care of, and I felt safe.
Are you familiar with the book Trust, Surrender, Receive?
I don't think I am, actually.
So pretty hilarious, actually, because I haven't even read the book, but the title holds so much meaning for me that I haven't even actually read it yet. It's what's your experience, or I guess lack thereof experience, with psychedelic guided initiation ceremonies or vision quests?
Yeah, I've never actually been on one, to be honest. But
Is that something that interests you?
It is. I'm very intrigued by it, and I've just never, at least up till this point, I haven't felt like I haven't felt the call. But I remain open to that if the time feels right, and if I feel that it's something that would be of service for me, which I imagine it would be. But yeah, I just haven't dove down that path yet. But I know lots of people that have.
Yeah, I've become very passionate about talking to people about psychedelics. One, because of the silly taboo surrounding them. And two, because I've been hyperactively focused on personal development and traumas and healing and things like that since I was, 14 or 15. As soon as I acknowledged that my father had an insane, unbelievable childhood that exposed to, his father was a cult leader where they would take children and sexually stimulate them with each other and make it cut each other, set each other on fire, and all kinds of crazy messed up stuff. And things like that obviously leave a mark on a person, and then that then affects everyone else in their life. And though my father never did any of those stuff to us, there were still a whole lot of things that he dealt with that, were passed down to me energetically. People understand that genes get passed down through generations, but they don't understand that two things, that trauma is present in your actual DNA. And so it can be passed down physically like that, but then energetically, those kind of traumas and things get passed down as well. And I had this whole journal that I've titled, "This Is Not Mine." Because when I was, I think 14, my mother realized, my mom has always been my best friend. She knows my father's problems intimately. And so it was really easy. All of a sudden when I was 14, she started saying, "That is so weird because your father has that exact same issue." And it was very confusing as a child because I didn't have the experiences to justify the results, the things that I was experiencing. So it was very confusing. And finally I started realizing, thanks to my mother, all these different things that were present in my energy field, my emotional makeup that were just passed down from my dad. And so, I've done everything. I've utilized yoga, Reiki, handprint analysis, personalized biophotonic frequencies to literally restructure neural and emotional DNA patterns, energy clearing sessions, talk therapy, counseling, the whole ashram experience, meditation, all the different personal development books and things like that. And so I've been hyperactively in that field for a long time. And it wasn't until about a year and a half ago that I finally removed the wall I'd had internally, both from being raised Mormon and from being in, our society where if it's not nicotine and alcohol, it's considered a drug and it's bad, because nicotine and alcohol are just super great for you. And so I started experimenting with these very guided, intentional trip sessions with LSD and shrooms and MDMA. And every single time, obviously it's an incredible recreational experience. I've never done it, just fooling around or out at a party or anything like that. Not saying you shouldn't, just I have not. And every single time there has been like years worth of these other therapeutic methods all shoved into this little 4 to 8 hour experiences, and the growth, the integration, like the permanent integration of these lessons has been unbelievable in my life. Like I did my first MDMA session. It was just focused on myself and the amount of self-love, because I struggle with a lot of what you were talking about, where your personal your personal struggles when you were younger, where I had a whole lot of body issues, self-love issues, self-worth, self-esteem, and the self-love that comes from, again, a very intentional, there's a lot of things around making sure it's a good experience, but, you know, a guided MDMA experience. Like, I was able to revert back to how I was when I was younger, before I'd put up a whole bunch of emotional walls. I'm so much more interested in people again. I'm so much more open and sensitive the way I used to be before I put up all these walls from experiencing rejection and heartbreak and things like that. And this is actually the first time I've talked about this. I mean, I've hinted at, you know, I'm sure the listeners are aware because I've hinted at use like that, but this is the first time I've very clearly said it. And it's something that I'm very excited about talking more passionately about, because it takes these kinds of experiences we're talking about here, and it just gives you, it's just a different conduit to being able to access different growth and different peace within yourself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's an interesting topic for me to navigate as an educator and in my role with Journeymen, because on a personal level, I feel like I am who I am today because of all of my life experiences and what I've done up to this point. And part of that is certain drugs and psychedelics. And at the same time, and I feel like they've had a tremendously beneficial impact on my life and on my psyche and my perspective of the world. And I feel like it's delicate. And, you know, working with teenagers, I'm cautious as to what I share because, you know, they're still young, their brains are still developing. And I didn't start navigating some of those other, you know, stronger substances until I was an adult, until it was later in life. And I do feel like there's tremendous healing potential in certain substances and, you know, mind expanding, perspective building experiences. But at the same time, I think it comes with caution. And it's like, well, how do we speak to these experiences with young people so that we're not like encouraging them to go and try LSD or mushrooms at age 14, 15. So it's an interesting balance, you know, because we do in-school mentoring and I'm also a teacher in the district. So I've just noticed that tension within myself, like how much about my past do I actually feel I can share and what's of service for these boys and at different stages. You know, obviously like with our elementary and middle school groups, I just don't talk about that at all. And then with our high school guys, I kind of read the field and hear where they're at and listen to what they're going through and start to open up a bit more about my own experiences, meeting them where they are and maybe just slightly beyond that to help them kind of formulate their own idea of where to head next without, you know, sharing the whole book, so to speak, as you mentioned, right? It's like, are we sharing those lesson points and just sharing that up front, or are we telling the story and letting them kind of make meaning from it from there? Right. So yeah, it's been a balance that I'm still kind of figuring out as I walk this life of mentor and teacher in a small community where everybody knows each other.
Yeah, I feel for you on that because I'm in a much more liberal position here to where I don't work for any one particular employer, and I can. The thing that drives me nuts here is we're allowed to tell all the stories that they can learn from, except for the ones, you know, like what we're talking about right now. And I think one of the reasons I'm getting so passionate about this is because someone has to start pushing the dial towards getting this to be a non-taboo topic anymore, because the results have been unbelievable. Now, again, obviously with all the parameters around it being that I didn't start trying this till I was like 27 or 26, which by that point your brain, you know, whatever is fully formed, you're an adult, blah, blah, blah. And I was just in Phoenix hanging out with one of my good buddies. And I'm close friends with his kids, and I've, you know, been friends with them for years and years. So watching them grow and develop, and as his boys are getting to a teenage age, you know, I have conversations with his parents all the time about how do you guys want me to navigate this? If Aiden asks me this question, what am I allowed to share with caution? What would you like? They're very Christian and they have a different viewpoint on life than I do. And so I asked them, I'm like, look, my default is truth with caution, but you know, they're your kids. So what would you like me to say? If they ask me something that you don't want me to talk about, do you want me to smoothly navigate away from it? Or can I clearly say, this is something your parents would prefer me not to talk to you about, maybe when you're older, blah, blah, or is it just, you know, no holds barred, full honesty, and he can make his own decisions? So on that topic I kind of want to talk about fatherhood, because obviously that is one of the ultimate role model positions as a man. How you've talked a lot about how in your mentorship position, which is essentially a father position, it sounds like you ask a lot of questions to guide rather than instructing and giving advice. And I've always wanted to, kind of like how you have a claim or statement for who you are, I wanted to kind of put a concise statement on what I think makes like the foundation of fatherhood, because I think a lot of people take the role of lecture or professor or something with their kids, rather than they are. I don't know. I resonate with the fact that kids, they're full human beings. They're just learning the same way you did. And so to me, to be guided is to ask a lot of questions that incur thoughtfulness and let you make your own decisions, rather than saying this is the right way and that's the right way. So are you a father actually, Alex?
No, I am not actually.
Okay.
I look forward to that day.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you see, I'm sure you have conversations with these kids' fathers during the integration process, during, I mean, all different parts of the process. How do you see this changing the way that you would be a father when you have children of your own?
Whew. That's a big question. I feel like the list is endless. I do sense that this work with Journeymen is going to help me tremendously as a parent. And I really do think the biggest thing is just around asking the right questions and listening with curiosity, not making assumptions. And one of the big things that comes to mind for me is just the need for our elders, so in this case fatherhood, for the adults in the family unit to make space by kind of stepping out of some of these power roles and some of these leadership roles to step away and make space for the next generation. And so for new men to come of age, the current men in the tribe or in the family unit need to make some space, or else there's going to be a power struggle. And I think that's often what happens in family dynamics when boys start to, step into young adulthood in their teenage years, is they are ready to claim some more responsibility. They want more freedom. And oftentimes the parents aren't quite ready to start let go of their little boy. And to maintain that power and control in the family. Like I'm the father, or I'm the parent, and this is my house and I pay the bills. And so you need to do what I say. And I think that's when we start to get into conflict. And that's when kids start wanting to leave the house, or they start lying to their parents, or they, just close the door and lock themselves in their room. But for me, as I think about what I look forward to as a father, is really making space for my son or daughter to step into their wholeness and to claim parts of themselves as an adult or as a leader in the family, and to make space for them to make mistakes, to make space for them to take initiative, to give space for their freedom. But with that also comes extra responsibility. And if those responsibilities aren't met, then maybe that freedom, maybe you're not ready for that yet. But to give space for them to make mistakes, to fail, to fall, to scrape their knees, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. I started laughing there when you were discussing the power play that starts to happen as you transition into, an older age teenager. I remember that exact time frame when it started happening with my father around 16, I think, is when I started having, I guess feeling more like not so much a boy, more like a guy, and thinking, well, I mean, you're teaching me all these man things, but then within your home, it's like it's your home and you're the king and that's it. And I don't know. I'm super excited. I don't know if I'm gonna have kids. I'm completely open to it at the moment. Well, first of all, I'm not even in a relationship, so obviously I don't want any kids right now.
Yeah, don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Definitely not. And I don't know. When I think about the future, when I meditate, when I have these deep experiences, so far none of them have been centered around or even influenced by the thought of fatherhood. I suspect that will come up organically over the next who knows how many years, because I already acknowledge this passion that I have for providing, giving a return on value to the community that has given me the kind of growth that I've experienced. I get really, passionate about returning value. And so I think that's a pretty fatherly type, feeling. So maybe that'll come up at some point, but I'm always wondering about how I'm going to be as a father and what kind of approach I'll take to it. It makes me think of something Plato said that one of my buddies just posted this quote, and I want to get your opinion on this, because with these trips, organizations have leaders, and everyone knows, when you have multiple, it's tough to have multiple leaders in an organization, but with what you're doing, it's almost like you're trying to create a bunch of mini leaders. So Plato said, Taylor Overmiller, who actually lives, he's in Portland, so he's not too far from you guys. But anyways, he said the most important qualification for any leader is not wanting to be a leader. And Plato said that, and I immediately said I take issue with this, because I think obviously it has value under certain circumstances, but I think humility's value as a virtue is way overblown to, appeal to the general population's projected insecurities onto exceptional people. Successful leaders, in my opinion, all share one common trait. They believe that they can all do a better job than their alternatives. And there's so much emphasis on humility. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, every time I win a race or I do something big in my life, the amount of my people in my peer group where the first thing they say is, all right, just don't let it go to your head. And I'm like, why is that the default, that we're all pushed towards humility and being humble rather than just assuming that someone can experience success and be confident without it meaning that they have a big head? So while you're helping these boys discover confidence in themselves and to be leaders in their own homes, in their own lives, and their own relationships, where do you strike the balance between confidence and humility, complete trust in yourself, like betting on yourself first, and having the acknowledgement that, the more you know, the more you realize that there's more you'll never know than you ever actually do know? That was a really confusing way of saying that.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer, to be honest. And I think I'm going to be walking away after our conversation today and really sitting with that. It's like, and for me personally, trying to run a nonprofit here, that does require a sense of confidence and an understanding that I am a capable and qualified leader in our community. And I recently heard a quote that really resonated with me, which was a leader in every seat. And recognizing that every one of us on this planet has capacity for leadership, and that shows up in different ways. Some people are louder, more gregarious, the big voice in the room, but other people lead in different ways. Maybe they're steering from the back of the ship. Maybe they're leading by example, but doing so quietly. And yeah, to speak to your notion on humility, I personally, I feel that there's value in being humble. And I think what that does, as if you're a competent, qualified leader and yet doing so with humility, I think that gives people more of an opportunity to, in my opinion, trust and connect with you as a leader or as a pillar in your community, rather than someone that just toots their own horn all the time and walks around like I'm the greatest gift, like I'm here because I can do this better than you kind of mentality, I think that's going to turn a lot of people away. So rather than bringing people together and strengthening our efforts through community or through connection, I think we're more kind of straying towards the competition versus cooperation. And I'm extremely competitive by nature. I love competition. And I feel like there's times when that doesn't serve. And by coming of age and swimming in a culture of capitalism, I think we're conditioned to be competitive, to be the best, to be the fastest kid on the soccer team, to get better scores on the SAT than our peers. And in many ways that serves, but I think ultimately that can creep into other parts of our lives that would really be best served in cooperation rather than competition. And so I feel like that humility, in my opinion, gives space for others to connect with someone that would otherwise be intimidating or a turnoff because they're so arrogant or they're so capable that like, I can't engage with them, or I can't work with them. I'm not worthy, or I don't want to because they're just so arrogant. So yeah, I feel like it's a balancing act, right? It's like, how do you be confident and humble? How do you like communicate this capability within yourself without coming across as arrogant or turning people away from what you're doing or your mission?
Beautifully said. It makes me think of the quote, arrogance is believing that you're better than somebody else. Confidence is knowing that no one is better than you, which I know is kind of saying the same thing. It's just the spirit or the focus of the statement. It's not so much about who you're better than, rather than you just believing you're the best, which
yes,
again, it's kind of the same thing, but it's just the focus of the confidence.
Right. It's beautiful. Honestly, it's a shift of perspective. And it reminds me of one of my mentors shared with me that landed so deeply. His name's Michael Mead. He's an author and mythologist, and highly recommend reading some of his work if you haven't already. But what he shared at a workshop that I went to was that he said, we live in a culture that celebrates fame and stardom largely because we've forgotten about the stars in our own hearts. And so bringing it back to what you just said, it's like, it's really, confidence is just about remembering that no one else is better than us, that not that we're better than anyone else, but that we're all equals here. And so here we live in a culture where we're like just worshiping these famous celebrities in film and music. And his argument is that, well, largely because we don't believe that we have that capacity for brilliance and for stardom in our own hearts. And I think if we can have that confidence and remember like our worth and our value in this place and in this planet, then we'd live in a very different culture.
Yeah. I look forward to a general shift in society towards that. And I'm very grateful for the type of work you're doing, my friend. It's made me start keeping an eye out for organizations that are doing similar work. And at some point, I reached out to you originally when Matt had gotten us in contact to see if there was a way I could participate somehow in this. Right now, it's been to be able to get you on the podcast and chat about these kind of topics. But, hopefully moving forward, there'll be something where I can actually, feet in the dirt, actually get out there and do some kind of experience with you guys. But I want to be cognizant of your time because I could keep talking to you about this forever. We're coming up on about an hour and a half now. So I appreciate you coming on, Alex. You gave a lot of value, and I know the listeners got a lot of value of it. I did as well. So thank you so much for coming on. And where can people get connected with Journeymen, or do you have any kind of call to action you want to end with?
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you, Benjamin, for the invitation. I really appreciated our conversation as well, and look forward to more to come. And yeah, for any listeners that are interested in learning more about our work or getting involved as a mentor, or if they have a son that might benefit from coming on one of our experiences, our website is journeymen.us. And we just finished our brand new website. So we'd love for people to go check that out. And we also have a podcast as well called Right Ways Radio. And we explore youth development and modern rites of passage with a lot of different experts from around the world. So would love to have people visit our website and reach out directly if they want to get involved in any way. And likewise, would love to get you up here in the Seattle area one of these days when the time works.
Awesome. Alex, I appreciate it, man. I've been trying to get out to Seattle for a Spartan race or something for a long time. I was able to make it out to Tacoma for a smaller race series that isn't really around anymore a couple years ago, but it's going to happen at some point. And I look forward to actually meeting you in person.
Yeah, likewise, Benjamin. Thank you again for the invite.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.
Visit obstacledominator.com for show notes, training, and racing resources.